from the Midwestern Marx Institute and is also an instructor for the Midwestern Marxism course, and author Carlos Garrido. We're going to be talking about the Cuban truth. And we're talking about myths about Cuba and what the truth is, about Cuba and how we can actually benefit from it. As far as Cuba goes, a lot of times people go, well, they're under a dictatorship. And one of the things that I learned is that Cuba has a very vibrant democratic process. If you can kind of go over that just a little bit, so that people realize that in many ways, and maybe it's just me, but it feels like Cuba has more of a democracy than we do.
Right. Well, that's a wonderful question, and I like the way you frame the discussion as the truth about Cuba. And um, I think just in terms of how we think about truth, we can perhaps start the distinction there because for many of the commentators on Cuba, specifically from the Belly of the Beast and from those from the Cuban diaspora who try to monopolize the sentiment that Cubans feel about Cuba, the way that the Cuban truth is approached is on a very superficial level, right? They take certain facts about Cuban reality right now, certain necessities that it has, certain forms of poverty that exists, and they say this is a result of socialism. This is the essence of Cuba. This is what socialism has done to my great country that before the revolution my parents were living so well in. And they remove all of the context, right? All of the contradictions, the development, and they're unable to look at things from the perspective of Cuba as a social totality embedded in a world dominated by global capitalism and imperialism, and they're unable to see the plurality of factors that are the conditions for the possibility of allowing that fact that they're looking at to be there. And so the question of truth must be approached from the lens of the whole, right? What's the Cuban trajectory been like? What's Cuba's relationship to American imperialism? What are some of the difficulties that have been presented to Cuba? What are their sources, et cetera, et cetera? As far as the question of democracy, maybe we can hit on the other part later. But as far as the question of democracy, it is without a doubt that Cuba is far leaps ahead, more democratic than the U.S. or than any other liberal bourgeois democracy, and even in its own terms, right? So the terms of what constitutes democracy in the West, it's usually in the capitalist West, is usually reduced to elections and electoral participation, et cetera, et cetera. In Cuba, you have much more participation in elections. They're much more frequently. The percentage of the population that participates in them is often regularly 30 to 40% higher than those who participate in American elections. And if you look at municipal elections and you compare them to like U.S. local elections, in the U.S. there's anywhere from 70 to 80% of people not participating in those. In Cuba, it's the vast majority of them who are. So in terms of like the bourgeois capitalist notion of what constitutes democracy, the ability to participate in elections and for the people through elections to elect their representatives, it is far, far more democratic in those terms. But I think, however, as Marxists, as socialists, we should adapt ourselves to rethinking the concepts that are used in a more quotidian sense by our societies. And we have to rethink what democracy itself is. And I think we can go to the roots of this word, which is demos and kratos. Demos means the people, the common folk, not just Wall Street billionaires, the common folk, and kratos means power. And so democracy, when you bring it together, is power of common people, the power of the people. And it's very clear, very, very clear. And, bourgeois institutions, Ivy League schools, repeat this conclusion after countless studies that the U.S. is nowhere near that. That in terms of who decides what gets done and what doesn't get done and who gets elected and who doesn't is more than 99% of the times determined by the interest of the monopoly classes, by money. It's not determined by the people. The people can want something very, very badly, and if the oligarchs do not want it, it doesn't get passed. And the people can protest against something very, very strongly, and if the oligarchs don't, if the oligarchs want it, it will get passed. And what's democracy there? Yeah, you have the electoral stuff, people going to the booth every 2 to 4 years, but what's the substance of democracy there, right?
Hmm.
In Cuba, that's not the reality. In Cuba, the people feel represented by their government. The approval ratings are very highly, and it's genuinely the people that are in power because the government itself, the state, the institutions do not exist for the sake of suppressing labor and upholding the interests of capital, as they do in our country, which is what we would call in scientific terms a dictatorship of capital. The will
Yeah.
that prevails is the will of capital and the personified agents of capital, which we call capitalists. In Cuba, it's a dictatorship of labor, a dictatorship of the people,
Mhm.
which means that it is the people that govern, and so it's qualitatively a different, richer, broader, more profound form of democracy.
Just for the audience, because a lot of times, like somebody like myself, like a couple years ago, would come on a stream like this, and I'd be kind of confused at some of the lingo. And so when we say bourgeois, you're pretty much talking about the business owners, the big business owners, the corporatists, as they say. And so, really, instead of having a country that is dominated by the owners of these corporations, these billionaires and millionaires, it is actually the person who's the barista that has a say, the person who works in construction, the truck driver, the person that the custodian that's cleaning the toilets. They have just as much as a say as anybody in the country, including people who are disabled, who are jobless like myself. They also have just as much of a say as anybody else within this system. And one of the things, one of the tidbits of information that I found out about Cuba, and I don't know if you remember a few months back, but I put out a tweet and it got some traffic. But one of the things I said was, why don't we lower the age of voting to 16? And a lot of people were like, oh my God, you want 16-year-olds to vote? I'm like, well, if they are able to drive a 4,000 pound projectile in the streets next to me and make that judgment when it comes to driving their cars, then yes, they absolutely do also have a say in how our country is ran. Because guess what? They're literally driving on our streets. And in Cuba, you are automatically registered to vote at 16, which I'm like, that's a great idea, because if they are able to have all these different things, as far as their, as far as they get to operate within the system, at the capacity that they have, then of course they should have a say. And also 16-year-olds work. No taxation without representation, right? So if you have 16-year-olds in Cuba that can vote and they're working and they're getting their taxes taken out of their check, well, why not here? But for some reason, we tend to devalue our young people in this country. Whereas in places like Cuba, if you're 16-year-old and working, you are valued, which is interesting, So if you want to speak on that, but I just thought it interesting how you're automatically registered.
Right, and just a general culture of voting. I'm sure you know, but when you go up to the polls, you have the people that control the polls, that overwatch and that manage the whole voting process, are pioneros, which are young Cuban students. So from a very early age, what we would consider here middle school, late elementary, you have kids that are involved in the voting process, getting in touch with the community, learning the importance of popular participation in these frequent elections which take place in Cuba. And yeah, of course, they're able to vote from very early on, and that's fundamental.